February 14 marks the anniversary of the Bahraini Revolution. This was one of the first revolutions of the Persian Gulf Arab countries, which is still evolving until today. From the harsh crackdowns to kangaroo courts to torture and mass arrest, the regime has crushed any form of opposition. So why does the revolution continue? And why doesn't it lead to the removal of the ruling Al Khalifa regime? In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the Bahraini Revolution and see whether the opposition has any chance of taking this revolution to the next level. First, let me introduce our guests for this edition of the program. Ghina Rebai joins us. She's a researcher from the Bahrain Forum for Human Rights, who joins us from Beirut. Also joining us is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Welcome to you both. Ghina Rebai, let me first start with you and ask you if you recall the day, February 14th, we saw protests to have erupted in Bahrain, which had erupted before, but not in the scale that it did back then. Of course, this is going back a number of years now, 2011. And it was one of the first to actually break out in the Arab world at that point. Why do you think it came about in the way that they did, in the numbers that they did back then? And of course, you know, they obviously felt not only were they marginalized, but they weren't part of the political system.
Good evening to you and to all the people who are watching us now. The beginning of the Bahrain revolution was part of what was called then the Arab Spring. But the people of Bahrain distinguished themselves from other peoples of the Arab Spring in that they did not demand the overthrow of the regime, but rather demanded reforms and demanded civil, political, and welfare rights, because that is what they lacked. The opposition leadership called for dialogue with the authority in order to reach a consensus that satisfies all. So the presence of the Al Khalifa dynasty in power was not under threat, but rather it was actually a golden opportunity for the Al Khalifa dynasty to gain popular legitimacy, even though they are an unelected dictatorial authority. However, they faced the demands with peaceful. They faced the peaceful demands and demonstrations with repression and killing, and by summoning the Peninsula Shield forces from Saudi Arabia to support the Bahraini authorities by committing massacres against the peaceful protesters. Today, the revolution continues. The people still lack what they didn't get, and actually their demands are even more. They're now demanding the unconditional and immediate release of prisoners of conscience. Mm-hmm. The people insist on their demands because they realize that by retreating or submitting, the situation will not return to the way it was before the start of the revolution on February 14, 2011, but it will become worse, and the Al Khalifa behavior will become more vengeful and brutal, because they clearly express grudges towards everyone who objects to their policy. Right. The people of Bahrain expressed their will to continue through their protests, and that they are ready to make more sacrifices until their goals are achieved. Okay. Some of these protests are held on a daily basis. We, as human rights organizations, we monitor them daily, and they're still going on. Okay.
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out here, Tony Gosling, in terms of the way that the Al Khalifa regime has dealt with not just the protests, but the Bahrainis from that point until now, because we're looking at, for example, how they still banned the media, doesn't operate there since 2017, unless it's in one form or another that's for any particular, for example, event, like the racing events, it's the F-15, I forget what it's called. Or if you have, for example, opposition that have been dissolved, I mean, it just makes it look like they have something to hide. They don't want any of this opposition to leak out. They've arrested, prosecuted, they've harassed, obviously, the human rights defenders, journalists, etc. What is the deal with them? Why are they trying so hard? It's been so long. If they put all that time into doing something about it, perhaps at this point something might have come out of it.
Well, look, you're quite right to say they've got something to hide, but they're not the only Gulf state with something to hide. A lot of these countries are now normalizing relationships with Israel. if you can believe that, even though they're majority Arab countries. You know, what is going on? Something completely surreal, almost absurd. Obviously, it's not absurd for those, and I'm sorry to disappoint you, but there was no revolution. Obviously, there is, you know, a movement against the government for the repressive authoritarian regime. Human Rights Watch is talking about their human rights record as dismal. Torture is normal. Demonstrators, human rights demonstrators, are executed in Bahrain. And of course, it was part of the 2011 Arab Spring. This is the same in many, many countries where this Arab Spring took place. In fact, in Egypt, probably one of the worst, was where the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. And what happened? The Americans intervened with the US, basically the Pentagon and the US deep state intervened there. And then just toppled the government. And most of the people who've been involved in the revolution, in it, as many saw it at the time in Egypt, were jailed and executed. So these were, in a way, a kind of trick by the United States in order to spark a revolution and then to identify the competition with the established order.
What do you mean tricked by the U.S. to start or spark a revolution? I'm not too sure I follow that. Can you explain that a little bit further?
What I'm saying is, I think the Arab Springs were, and there is evidence that there was, although of course there's a genuine movement out there, that some of that was triggered deliberately by elements in the West who wanted to flush out the opposition in these countries. Look, Bahrain is a tiny place. It's basically was used for pearl diving, and it was the British Empire that created this nightmare we have now by creating what they wanted was a port, an independent state, a port. In the 1970s, as the British Empire was collapsing, in 1971, you got around about 1.5 million population, half of which are migrant workers there. And in 1973, in 2 years, they had to suspend the constitution. This has been basically a set up by the British, an authoritarian puppet state, which is now doing pretty much exactly what the Western world wants. And that is proved with this normalization with Israel, which is an apartheid state, as Desmond Tutu in South Africa said before he died, bless him. He's pointed out that this Israeli state is more apartheid even than South Africa was, more racist against the Palestinians because it wants to wipe the Palestinians out. Now, how can any Arab country in its normal mind be normalized relations with Israel? It's impossible.
Well, you talked about a few different issues or topics there. You know, let me ask you about first the so-called normalization that Bahrain was so keen to do after the UAE. I mean, pretty much within a month, it came out and established ties. Well, I said reestablished is a slip of the tongue because we know behind the scenes Israel does have a relationship with these Persian Gulf Arab countries and their monarchies. One of the angles behind this normalization is said that Bahrain wanted to make sure that it's in U.S.'s, so to speak, good hands or a positive outlook from the White House on Bahrain in order to make sure that the U.S. somewhat overlooks the human rights violations that are taking place on the island. But here we are 2 years later. What did the Bahrain gain from this so-called normalization? What did it do for it?
Nothing.
No, this would be for, I'm sorry, for Ghina Rebai.
Sorry.
I'll come to you with that question, Tony Gosling. Go ahead, Ghina Rebai.
Okay. So to speak about the base of the problem, in Bahrain there is a minority that rules the majority. What does this minority base on in order to be able to impose itself on the majority of the people? It is based solely on its alliances with strong countries, specifically USA and Britain, and now Israel. Israel is not as strong as before, but Bahrain would do anything for the USA just to stay. Al Khalifa would do anything just to stay in power. They receive support from them, and not only the silence on their crimes. Here I want to point out something that Sheikh Isa Qasim said today, the leader of the Bahraini opposition. He spoke about the Bahraini authorities fight against religion. We as human rights organization, we do monitor that, but he said their fight against religion is unjustified because the authorities does not need it to maintain their rule. He said that this fight against religion is an external condition for their staying in power. Yes, To this extent, the Bahraini authorities would obey the dictates of its external allies, because the basis of its very presence in power is based on its alliances with these countries. So yes, it would normalize, it would do anything
When
just
you,
so
when you
that
talk about religion
dynasty.
from Sheikh Issa Ghassem, are you talking about how he is saying that they are somewhat differentiating then between the Shias and the Sunnis? Because that's not that's not what really, for example, Iran doesn't look at it that way. Iran as a third party on looking this whole situation. I'm just wondering what you mean by the religion aspect there.
No, he clearly said today that there is a fight against religion. It's not a fight against a sect or just slander, creating slander between sects in Bahrain. There is a fight against Islam, as he said. And he said they don't need it. Actually, we do monitor that. They broke mosques, and they daily in prisons, they deprive Muslim prisoners sometimes from praying. It happens a lot. Yes, so he said they don't need it. Why do they do it? And he says it is an external dictation just as a condition to stay in power. Yes, and we do see that clear because we do monitor it.
What are they so afraid of by doing that, though? When you say that, obviously they feel like they can relinquish the importance that the majority have in terms of, for example, the Shias. And I'm not trying to turn this into a Shia or a Sunni thing. I'm just curious about that, because they are obviously afraid by making that type of or having that type of approach towards the rest of the Bahraini population, right?
Well, it happens that the majority are Shia, so they are afraid that the Shia would take over the rule. But you know what? From the beginning, the opposition, in all its sects and all its ideologies, political ideologies, some of them are not religious-based. They're only asking for, demanding for, I forgot the term in English, reforms and civil rights and welfare rights.
Right.
Today, despite all the crimes committed by the Bahraini authorities, and despite the presence of the political opposition leaders in prisons and abroad, and despite the presence of more than 2,000 prisoners of conscience in prisons, the popular opposition forces are still calling on the authority to dialogue. The Deputy Secretary General of the Al-Wifaq National Islamic Society called on dialogue just today. They still called for dialogue because they reflect their seriousness in the demands that they always called on.
Okay.
That they only
let me direct that angle of what you said to our guest Tony Gosling. A call for dialogue. It sounds simple enough. Why doesn't the U.S. make that call? Why doesn't the U.K. make a call for the ruling family to have dialogue with the opposition, which, well, they have disbanded, but I mean, that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
Well, of course it does, but the godless West, although it sometimes talks about Christianity, of course, it's just like the Knights Templar and the Crusades. It's got nothing to do with real Christianity. They look at what's been going on in Ukraine too. There is no wish to dialogue. The idea is war, I'm afraid, because war makes a lot of money and war can grab resources. So, I mean, there's, by the way, really important to stress when you're talking about Bahrain, any of your viewers that want to look into what happened there, and I mean, it's a horrific story what the regime did in the Arab Spring. Your competition, Al Jazeera, did a documentary, Shouting in the Dark, I remember watching, which is absolutely shocking to see how a government can treat its people. A government is supposed to really be a servant of its people. This government is not. It is afraid of its people. And actually, it's when I talk about the godless West, this is just another puppet regime of the West, just like Zelensky in Ukraine. Puppets, these people are not sovereign countries whatsoever. And actually, they're puppets of an organization called CENTCOM. CENTCOM dominates the Middle East, and it is a US military office, part of the American military plans to dominate the world. They have these offices for all parts of the world. They're that arrogant. And actually, of course, the EU and the UK are also part of this, this coalition, which is attempting war. Now, the reason why is because they are having an international push right now for a world government, and they want that war to cause so much chaos that they can say, well, come on, we all need to get together and sort this out, but they want to dominate the outcome. And that's how crazy they are. They're not interested in a multipolar world with different countries having different cultures, different points of view. They're trying to force the issue by forcing a world war. And Bahrain is just one more puppet on that string.
Well, you have the US's Fifth Fleet that's stationed there. Rebai, you have the UK that established a military base in the year 2018, which it said was to strengthen its presence in West Asia. Of course, when you have these two countries that are supposedly the flag bearers of democracy right under their nose, as you mentioned, 2,000 prisoners of conscience, torture, abuses, etc., puts into question why they are overlooking that. But is the bigger question right across that bridge by the name of Saudi Arabia, which is why the U.S. Wanted to prevent this revolution from progressing at the rate that it was, because it was right at the back door of Saudi Arabia, and it couldn't afford for the kingdom to pretty much have its population rise against it. Do you agree with that?
It could be. I don't have facts about that, but yes, it could be like that. Anyway, today the Bahraini people are given a second chance to the government, to the Al Khalifa dynasty, but there is no loom that the authorities will respond to the peaceful demands. But about the political reasons behind why the U.S. is doing that, or we really don't know. But we do know for a fact that the USA and Britain can simply order the Bahrain authorities not to repress its people, and the Bahrain authorities will be more than happy to comply, because it is the orders of its masters. They just don't, because they don't care about the Bahraini people, and because maybe, as you say, it is for their benefit that the Bahraini people are being repressed.
The way that the opposition has been crushed is really, in a sense, to use I can't use another word or think of another word right now, but farcical, Tony Gosling, when you take a look at the 2022 elections. I don't know if you recall, they held elections, but there were no opposition candidates. So they came out and they raved about the fact that there was such a turnout, you had so many people that came out, but they had banned the opposition candidates from this. I mean, that's whitewashing the whole thing. Basically, you had the two obviously main opposition groups who were banned from this. Again, it puts into question this notion of democracy that it seems like it's important for them to display to the world, so people get an idea that there is maybe some notion of that, but clearly there's not.
Well, look, it's an insult to the intelligence of Bahrainis, and it's an insult to the intelligence of every human being on planet Earth. This is a sham democracy. It's basically a puppet show, a stage show, and the idea that we all believe everything that we see on the Western television. I'm afraid this is, as one of my colleagues, for the stupid people. The idea is that nobody actually understands what's really going on, except the people maybe in Bahrain itself. And this is, of course, it falls at the feet of the Western press. The Western press is dominated. I used to work for the BBC myself, and I can tell you it's now become just a propaganda machine. The sort of thing when I was growing up, we were told went on in the Soviet Union. The idea that, you know, you've got a command economy and a one-party state. Effectively, you've got exactly the same in Bahrain, a one-party state, and democracy is a sham. But this will come to a head, and when the rubber hits the road, as they say, I'm quite certain that the Bahraini people will get what they want, but it may not be for a while yet, and there may well be much, much greater conflagration. Of course, the Middle East, the big focus for the West's point of view, still is the oil supplies. And I wonder, and I think the case is that the reason the West is going very anti-oil is because they know there's going to be a war, and they know that war will threaten their supply of oil. So that's why they're going bananas right now about electric cars and things like that. They're trying to stop oil because they know a war is coming. And I don't like to be the harbinger of bad news, but as far as I can see, both in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, the forces of darkness are really trying to push. And that's why they're not discussing, that's why they're not debating. But I wonder whether many of these caliphates and the people who are running the Gulf states realize what's going on. I'd like to warn them, watch out, do not trust the USA, do not trust your Western backers.
Sure. Well, and don't trust Israel. I think that's another thing that, again, Rebai, we can discuss a little bit more. In my question to you, and there was a really somewhat shocking act that occurred between Israel and the Persian Gulf island of Bahrain, where Israel bought an island there. I think it was to the tune of $150 million, where you had the daughter of one of the activists come out with a tweet that said that's best described as colonial expansion from a foreign ruling family that occupied Bahrain violently and has been ruling it violently. How dangerous is the Israeli factor in this, do you think?
The Bahraini authorities deal with Bahrain as if it's their property. I mentioned that earlier. This is definitely very much dangerous because they are selling lands. They not just this island. They are selling other lands in the mainland of Bahrain. It's all an island, a big island, but they are selling lands. It's as if they're turning it to a second Palestine. In some protests, people actually held banners that said we don't want to become a second Palestine because they're turning it into like a Jew. They say it's like Judaism project or something like that. As I agree totally with your other guest when he spoke about that the Bahraini authorities should be aware of their future because the USA has no future in being the solely pole in the world anymore. Today, the Bahraini authorities can still go back, can still go back in their steps, can still take their opportunity that is still given by the opposition, and I really don't see that they will do, but we can just hope. About the elections, I would like to say, please, I would like to comment
quickly.
that this is the third consecutive elections that happened this way. Opposition leaders who used to represent more than 60% of voters are now in prison and are not allowed to be elected anymore. That's how sham it is, and nobody cares in the whole world.
Thank you very much. We're going to end it there again, Rebai. We appreciate it. Researcher, Bahrain Forum for Human Rights from Beirut, Tony Gosling, investigative journalist from Bristol. Thank you to you both. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight from Mikhail Tahway and the team. It's goodbye.